From living in caves and fighting predators just to survive, to building cities that ruled the world, humanity's greatest transformation began with a single, desperate choice. This is the story of the agricultural revolution, the moment we stopped walking, started waiting, and reshaped the earth forever. For tens of thousands of years, we humans were nothing more than guests on this earth, travelers moving through vast forests and endless plains, never staying long enough to leave a scar. Every morning began with the same silent question: will we eat tonight, or will we starve? Every day was a battle to survive. We were either the hunters, or we were the hunted. Our eyes searched the horizon not for beauty, but for danger. Our ears listened to the wind not for music, but for the sound of something stalking us. There were no homes, no villages, no cities, only caves, temporary shelters, and the open sky. Life had one purpose and one purpose only: to stay alive. Tomorrow was not a plan, it was a hope. The future was measured in hours, not years. Survival was the only story that mattered. Small groups moved together, rarely more than 20 or 30 people at a time. These tribes were families, alliances, and lifelines combined into one fragile unit. To lose the group meant almost certain death. To stay meant sharing everything, even hunger. They followed the animals as they migrated across the land. They watched the plants, the seasons, the clouds, and the stars for guidance. Every change in the wind carried meaning. Nature was not scenery. It was a language that had to be understood to live. Shelter was temporary and light, never meant to last. A cave for a season, branches for a night, a hide stretched between trees for a week. Nothing was built to remain, because remaining was dangerous. When the land stopped providing, the tribe moved on. Stone tools were simple but precious, shaped patiently by hand. A sharp edge meant food, protection, and life. A broken tool meant vulnerability. Every object carried purpose and nothing was wasted. Danger was everywhere and never slept. Predators hunted humans just as humans hunted prey. Cold could kill as easily as teeth and claws. Hunger was a slow, quiet enemy that returned again and again. Death was not rare, it was expected. Children did not always grow old enough to run. Adults did not always live long enough to grow weak. Loss was part of the rhythm of life, not a tragedy, but a reality. Yet within this harsh world, humans learned to understand their surroundings deeply. They knew which plants healed and which killed. They knew the paths animals would take before the animals themselves arrived. They could read the land the way later people would read books. This intelligence was not written down, but passed from voice to voice and gesture to gesture. Knowledge lived in memory and practice, not in objects. Elders were libraries, and forgetting meant death. The mind became humanity's greatest tool. Then came fire, the first true revolution. Flames turned raw food into nourishment and darkness into safety. Fire pushed back predators and gathered people together at night. Around it, humans spoke, laughed, and shared stories. Fire changed the body and the mind. Cooked food gave more energy and time. Warmth allowed survival in colder lands. The night was no longer endless fear, but a place for connection. Around these fires, something new emerged: community. There was no wealth, no ownership, no hierarchy of things. Food was shared because hoarding meant death for the group. Equality was not ideology, it was necessity. No one owned the land and no one owned another human. Status came from skill, wisdom, and trust, not possessions. What you needed, the tribe provided if it could. Even in a world of survival, beauty appeared. On cave walls, humans painted animals, hands, and symbols. These were not decorations, but messages across time. They were proof that even in danger, the human mind reached for meaning. This way of life endured for nearly all of our existence. 96% of human history was spent as wanderers. Generation after generation lived and died without ever seeing a wall, a field, or a permanent home. The world was wide, and humans were small. But stability, even ancient stability, can break. The balance between humans and nature was fragile, always dependent on climate and life itself. Slowly, almost invisibly, the world began to change. Something approached that would end this way of living forever. The shift was not sudden, and it was not chosen freely. It was forced by pressures that grew year by year. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate turned against humanity. Temperatures dropped suddenly, and the land grew cold and dry. This period is known as the Younger Dryas, a shock that came without warning. It felt like the return of an ice age. Forests shrank and grasslands withered. Animals that humans depended on began to disappear. Mammoths, giant deer, and other megafauna vanished from the world. Food sources collapsed across vast regions. Some scientists believe melting ice disrupted ocean currents, freezing the climate. Others point to cosmic events or massive environmental shifts. The cause is still debated, but the effects are clear. The world became harsher and less predictable than ever before. Hunter-gatherers found their old knowledge failing them. The animals no longer came in the same numbers. The plants they relied on grew sparse or vanished. Hunting was no longer enough to survive. Hunger pushed humans into choices they had never made before. They began to dig deeper into the earth, searching for anything that could be eaten. Roots, tubers, and seeds that once were ignored now became precious. Even bitter grains and hard shells were crushed between stones and swallowed. Seeds were the last food of the desperate. They were small, hard, and gave little energy, but they were everywhere. Women and children gathered them from dry grasslands and dying forests. Hands bled from hours of grinding, but the tribe survived another day. At night, people sat around weak fires with bowls of crushed grain mixed with water. It tasted like dust and despair, but it filled the stomach enough to sleep. Hunger no longer screamed, it whispered. Some seeds were carried in bags of hide or woven grass. They spilled onto the ground when the tribe stopped for too long. Others fell near the shelters, pressed into the soil by bare feet. No one noticed. Weeks passed, and the tribe moved on as always. But some did not move far. The cold made travel dangerous, and the old paths no longer promised food. So they stayed near water, near the place where seeds had spilled. Then something strange happened. Where they had camped before, green shoots appeared, thin, fragile, impossible. Plants grew where none had been before, exactly where humans had eaten and slept. At first, it was confusion, then suspicion, then wonder. The land was answering in a way it never had. The soil remembered where humans had been. The next season, they stayed longer. They dropped more seeds, not by accident, but with hope. They protected the shoots from animals and trampled weeds around them. For the first time, humans waited instead of walking. Waiting was terrifying. If the plants failed, everyone would die together. But if they grew, there would be food without moving. This was not freedom, it was a gamble with extinction. The first harvests were small and uncertain, but they were predictable. And predictability was more powerful than abundance. For the first time, tomorrow became something more than a hope. People began to return to the same places each year. Camps became seasonal homes. Seasonal homes became permanent ones. The land that once rejected ownership now demanded it. Across the curved valleys of the Fertile Crescent, small clusters of homes began to appear where camps once vanished without a trace. Mud and reed shelters replaced hides and branches, pressed into the earth as if asking permission to stay. Wheat and barley fields spread slowly, uneven and fragile. watched over with fear and hope in equal measure. These settlements were not yet villages, but they were no longer camps either, existing in a tense space between movement and permanence. People still remembered how to leave, but each season made leaving harder. The land was becoming part of them, and they were becoming part of the land. Along the Nile, the river itself taught humans how to stay. Each year the floodwaters rose and fell, leaving behind dark soil that fed whatever touched it. People settled on the edges of this rhythm, planting emmer wheat and barley as the water retreated. Their homes were light but returning, built with the expectation of coming back after the floods. Food was tied to the river's patience, not to wandering feet. Life slowed to the pulse of water, and time became a cycle instead of a line. Survival now depended on watching the river as closely as hunters once watched animals. Far to the east, in the valleys of the Indus, people learned to tame water in smaller, quieter ways. Seasonal rivers and monsoon rains guided early fields of wheat, barley, and peas. Settlements formed near streams that could be trusted to return each year. Houses were built of mud brick and wood, simple and low, designed for work rather than comfort. People lived close together, sharing labor because farming could not be done alone. The land demanded cooperation, and cooperation slowly replaced mobility as the core of survival. In China, along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, a different kind of waiting began. Millet grew in the north, rice in the south, each requiring patience instead of pursuit. Fields were small, carved from wetlands and hillsides with careful hands. People learned to shape the land itself, flooding it, draining it, reshaping it season by season. Homes stood close to fields because distance now meant loss. Children grew up knowing the same trees, the same bends in the river, the same sky. The world was shrinking, but life was growing more certain. In the highlands of New Guinea, agriculture emerged without rivers or grain. People learned to cultivate taro, bananas, and yams in misty mountain soil. They cleared forest in small patches, planting and replanting in cycles that mirrored older rhythms of movement. Settlements were loose and flexible, but they returned to the same places again and again. The land was not conquered but negotiated with, one garden at a time. Food security came not from size but from diversity and care. Permanence here was gentle, not absolute, but it was still a break from wandering. Across the oceans in Mesoamerica, humans learned to coax life from forests and hills. Maize, beans, and squash grew together, supporting one another as much as the people who planted them. Early settlements formed near clearings, temporary at first, then returning again and again. Farming here was slow and uncertain, but it offered a promise hunting never could. People built simple houses, cleared fields, and learned to wait through drought and rain alike. The land no longer fed them by chance, but by agreement. Labor became organized around planting and harvest, tying communities to the soil. Rituals emerged to protect crops, calling on unseen forces to control rain and fertility. Agriculture transformed human life by creating surplus, and surplus created the first cities, allowing settlements like Uruk and Ur to grow into dense urban centers. Food surplus freed most of the population from farming and gave rise to specialists, builders, priests, traders, potters, administrators, turning cities into engines that converted grain into power and organization. Granaries became political institutions, and temples functioned as both religious and economic headquarters, managing rations, labor, and land. Religion, economy, and government merged from the very beginning. To manage complexity, Mesopotamians invented writing. Cuneiform began as accounting marks and evolved into full language, allowing contracts, laws, and debts to survive beyond memory. Technology followed urban needs. The wheel, plow, standardized bricks, and bronze tools expanded production and military power. Trade networks stretched from Lebanon to Afghanistan, making Mesopotamian cities the first nodes of a global economy. Law emerged to regulate life among strangers, replacing tribal custom with written authority. Hierarchies hardened with kings and priests at the top, farmers at the base, and slaves at the bottom. War became constant as cities competed for land and water. Despite violence and inequality, these cities created the foundations of civilization: writing, law, administration, science, and organized religion. In the Indus Valley, agriculture produced a very different urban model. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were planned, orderly, and standardized. Streets followed grids, bricks were uniform, and even small houses had wells and drainage. Water management was the civilization's core achievement. Covered sewers, neighborhood wells, and private bathing rooms created sanitation unmatched in the ancient world. Granaries stored surplus and supported full-time specialists, while standardized weights and seals unified trade across the region and beyond. Crafts reached extraordinary precision, from drilled carnelian beads to uniform pottery and metalwork. Unlike other early civilizations, the Indus cities show little evidence of kings, palaces, or monumental propaganda. Authority appears to have been administrative rather than coercive, based on systems rather than rulers. Writing existed but was used briefly and practically, not for display. Religion was subtle, integrated into daily life rather than dominating it. The system was efficient, quiet, and fragile. When rivers shifted and climate changed, agriculture failed, trade collapsed, and the cities emptied. Though they vanished, their legacy of urban planning, sanitation, and order remains unmatched. In Egypt, agriculture along the Nile produced cities that served the state, the gods, and the pharaoh. Urban centers like Memphis and Thebes were not marketplaces of free exchange, but tools of centralized control. The pharaoh, seen as a living god, stood at the center of cosmic order, and cities existed to collect tribute, organize labor, and enforce authority. Writing, mathematics, and accounting were instruments of power, enabling one of the most efficient bureaucracies of the ancient world. Labor was the foundation of Egyptian cities and was often forced. Slaves and corvée workers built temples, palaces, roads, and pyramids, living in planned settlements controlled by rations and quotas. Monumental architecture was made possible by suffering organized at scale. Temples were both sacred and economic centers, owning land, workshops, and slaves, while priests legitimized the state through ritual. Craft production flourished under state control, preserving artistic styles for millennia. Urban life was deeply unequal, with elites living near temples and workers crowded at the margins. Stability was achieved through hierarchy, not equality. In China, early cities such as Erlitou and later capitals like Anyang emerged as instruments of ritual and political power. These were carefully planned centers designed to concentrate authority, not free-flowing trade hubs. Palaces and ritual complexes stood at the core, aligned to sacred directions reflecting cosmic order. Space itself was political. Bronze production defined urban life, requiring massive coordination of mining, transport, fuel, and labor. Ritual vessels and weapons fused technology with religion, legitimizing rule through ancestry and ceremony. Writing emerged as oracle bone inscriptions, recording divination, harvests, and warfare, linking the ruler to ancestors. The written word became a tool of state memory and planning. Labor was tightly controlled, with registered farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers mobilized for large projects. Trade existed but was secondary to stability. Markets were regulated and private wealth limited. Religion structured daily life, binding obedience to cosmic order. Dynasties rose and fell, but the urban model endured, the city as a machine for order. In Mesoamerica, agriculture based on maize supported the rise of cities like San Lorenzo, La Venta, Teotihuacan, and later Tenochtitlan. These cities were built without metal tools, draft animals, or wheels, relying entirely on human organization. Urban life here was driven by ritual and cosmic order rather than bureaucracy. Ceremonial complexes and pyramids dominated city centers, aligned with celestial movements. The city itself became a calendar, measuring time through architecture and shadow. Labor was organized through obligation to gods and rulers, often coercive, and later included slavery and tribute. Ingenious agricultural systems, terraces, canals, raised fields, and chinampas turned hostile landscapes into surplus-producing machines. Writing, mathematics, and astronomy emerged to manage ritual cycles and tribute. Knowledge was controlled by priestly elites. Hierarchy was strict, with rulers at the sacred core and commoners on the outskirts. Captives were enslaved or sacrificed, making violence part of cosmic order. Cities formed networks of rivalry and dominance, culminating in imperial centers like Tenochtitlan. Across all regions, the first cities arose not from comfort, but from necessity. Agriculture created surplus, surplus demanded control, and control demanded organization. Cities became machines for managing people, land, belief, and time. Each civilization shaped its cities according to its deepest values: efficiency in the Indus, divine hierarchy in Egypt, cosmic order in China, ritual power in Mesoamerica, and administrative innovation in Mesopotamia. Yet every solution came with a cost. Cities concentrated wealth and power, turned people into labor, land into property, and belief into control. Slavery, inequality, and war became permanent features of human life. The walls that protected cities also trapped those inside them. At the same time, cities allowed humanity to remember. Knowledge no longer vanished with elders but accumulated across generations. Writing, mathematics, engineering, astronomy, and art flourished because people stayed in one place long enough to refine them. The city became humanity's external memory, preserving ideas beyond individual lives. Without cities, there would be no science, no history, no shared future. Modern systems of government, economy, and knowledge still rest on the first granaries and walls. Civilization is not a finished achievement but an ongoing process, begun the moment humans planted seeds and chose to stay.